The Leviathan is one of the largest deepwater oil rigs in the world and has served as a crucial source of revenue for the State of Israel.
Far out in the Mediterranean, engineers assembled a $30 billion machine designed to do something Israel had never managed before. It doesn't sit on land, it can't be seen from shore, and yet it now shapes decisions far beyond the country's borders. Built in deep water with unprecedented scale, this structure changed how energy, security, and infrastructure are planned across the region. At first, it looked like a technical solution. Over time, it became something much bigger and far more complicated. How Israel fixed its energy problem. For decades, Israel kept the lights on with fuel that came from somewhere else. The small country on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea had almost no oil of its own and no big gas fields on land. Almost all the energy for power stations came from ships bringing in oil and coal. If those links were cut by war, sanctions, or bad politics, there was very little inside the country that could replace them. From the late 1970s onward, huge coal plants on the coast became the heart of the system. One of the biggest was the Orat Rabin station near Hadera, built right by the shoreline so long piers could take coal straight from ships into the plant. Another large station near Ashkelon did the same thing. At the same time, Israel learned the hard way how fragile imported fuel can be. Oil boycotts made it clear how easily crude supplies could be choked off. Later on, natural gas began flowing from Egypt through the Arish-Ashkelon pipeline across the Sinai.
Finance Ministry earlier this year, in which it stated that Israel is poised to face a natural gas shortage in the next 25 years.
But after the Arab Spring, that pipeline was bombed over and over, cutting off the gas and forcing power plants to switch back to dirtier backup fuels. So the push to find a steady fuel under Israel's own control kept growing. Geologists had already proved that there was gas offshore. A small field called Mari B was found first, and then a much larger one called Tamar was discovered in the late 2000s and brought into production around the year 2013. Tamar sits under the seabed to the west of the country and began feeding gas into the grid, cutting the need for imported oil and coal. It was a big jump forward, but on its own it still could not guarantee long-term security for a growing economy. The real break came from a strange shape on a computer screen. An Israeli firm called Ratio had mapped an odd underground structure far out in deep water and pulled in partners, including Noble Energy from the United States and Dalek Group from Israel, to test it. They shot seismic surveys, which means sending sound waves into the rock to see what lies below, and then drilled an expensive wildcat well into the target. In late 2010, that well hit a huge gas reservoir. The partners named it Leviathan, and people in the industry immediately understood that this was on a totally different scale from earlier finds.
And meanwhile, in regional news, Israel's Leviathan partners have secured a crucial export deal with Egypt in what will be the largest gas deal in Israeli history.
Leviathan lies in the Levant basin of the eastern Mediterranean Sea, roughly 80 miles off the Israeli coast, in water about 5,000 feet deep. The gas-bearing rock sits thousands of feet under the seabed. Studies have put its recoverable gas at around 22 trillion cubic feet, which is roughly 600 billion cubic meters. That is enough to cover Israel's current domestic gas demand for many decades. But a deep-water field that far from shore is only useful if you can turn it into a working machine that brings gas safely and reliably to land. The first pieces of that machine sit on the seabed, out of sight. Drilling ships parked over the field and punched production wells down through the rock layers into the gas. Heavy steel pipes, valves, and safety systems on the seafloor control the flow. From each well, thick underwater pipelines were laid along the ocean floor, carrying raw gas from the deep field toward a shallower area closer to the Israeli coast where it would be easier to build a surface platform. That shallower zone is where most people first see Leviathan. Instead of placing a platform directly above the reservoir in very deep water, the developers chose to install a fixed platform in water a little under 300 feet deep, about 6 miles from the shoreline. This structure, often called Leviathan A, stands on a tall steel frame called a jacket that is anchored into the seabed. On top of that jacket sits a massive deck with the gas processing plant, control rooms, power systems, living quarters, and a helipad for crews. Building and installing that deck pulled in yards and ships from across the world. The topside modules were built in large shipyards linked to the United States offshore industry, assembled into huge steel blocks, and loaded onto one of the biggest heavy lift barges on Earth. That barge carried them across the Atlantic Ocean, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean Sea. In late 2019, the crane vessel Sleipnir, one of the most powerful crane ships ever built, moved into position off Israel's coast. It lifted the huge topside blocks, together weighing about 24,500 tons, and carefully set them down onto the waiting jacket, completing a series of record-breaking heavy lifts. Once the platform was in place, Leviathan stopped feeling like a drilling project and started behaving like a gas factory. Gas from the wells on the seafloor flows up into processing systems on the deck. As these plants came online, the fuel mix in the grid flipped. By the late 2010s, roughly 7/10 of Israel's electricity already came from natural gas, with a shrinking share from coal and only a few percent from renewables.
The big new natural gas finds will profoundly impact Israel's energy independence and promise to bring in some $60 billion.
By the middle of this decade, gas still provides about 70% of the country's electricity. Coal has fallen to well under 1/5, while solar now accounts for more than 1/10 of power generation. Officials say the goal is to push renewables toward 1/3 of the mix and fully phase out coal in the coming years. Steady gas has also changed the heavy industry inside Israel. The country is a major producer of fertilizers, potash, bromine, and magnesium metal, with large mining and chemical plants in the desert and along the coast. Many of these sites have already made the switch or are in the middle of switching from fuel oil and coal to natural gas for their own power and heat. The reason is simple. Gas burns cleaner, is easier to handle, and is often cheaper in the long run. Israel's shift from imported coal to its own natural gas did more than keep the lights on. It set off a second wave of construction above ground, where new gateways for ships and trains would shape how goods and people move in and out of the country. Israel's major transport upgrade. Haifa has long been one of Israel's main doors to the world. Container ships sail in from the Mediterranean, and most of the country's imports and exports pass over a handful of piers. Over time, that door became too small. The main state-run port had aging piers and shallow berths, so the new giant container vessels that carried more than 10,000 boxes at a time could not always come in full. Ships waited, costs rose, and official reviews warned that almost all of the country's sea trade was squeezed through a few overworked docks at Haifa and Ashdod. If Israel wanted to match its growing industry with serious export power, it needed a modern deep-water port, not just repairs to the old one. That is how the Bayport project started. In the middle of the last decade, Israel's Port Authority put out an international call for a company that would finance, build, and run a new container terminal in Haifa Bay under a long lease. The winner was Shanghai International Port Group, a large state-owned operator from China.
Is modeled after Shanghai's Yangtze port, #1 in the world in shipment turnover rates.
In the year 2015, it agreed to invest roughly $1.5 billion and to operate the new Bayport terminal for about 25 years. For Israel, the deal promised fresh capital and a modern port experience. For China, it offered a foothold on a key stretch of the eastern Mediterranean trade route. On the water, Bayport turned an empty strip of shoreline into a deep-water terminal. Engineers dredged the seabed so that ships could berth in water around 57 feet deep, enough for very large container vessels. They built a quay almost 5,000 feet long and laid out wide yards behind it. The basin was designed to handle some of the world's biggest box ships and to move around 1 to 2 million containers a year once fully busy. What makes the new harbor stand out is how much of it runs on automation. Tall ship-to-shore cranes move along the pier and reach over the decks. Operators can guide them from a control room on land. Inside the yard, automated stacking cranes place containers into tight rows, while driverless or partly driverless vehicles carry them back and forth between the stacks and the ships. A central computer tracks each container and plans its path so that trucks can pick it up without long waits.
Port is going automated. Artificial intelligence and digital technology are moving and powering commerce here.
Once Bayport opened in the early 2020s, that new capacity began to change how shipping lines saw Israel. companies gained a fresh, efficient gateway on the northern coast. Routes that once skipped Israel because of delays could now plan direct calls with deep draft ships. The private terminal also pushed the old state-run port to upgrade, because now there was a strong competitor just across the water. For exporters and importers, the effect showed up as shorter waiting times in the harbor and more reliable schedules. The choice of partner, though, made the project more than a local upgrade. Because Shanghai International Port Group is owned by the Chinese state, the long least stirred concern in Washington. The United States Sixth Fleet sometimes brings its ships into the nearby naval base in Haifa Bay, and American officials and analysts worried that a Chinese-run terminal sitting close to their warships might be used to watch them or tap into communications. The same cameras, antennas, and data links that keep an automated port running could also serve as a quiet listening post. Israel tried to answer those concerns without ripping up the contract. Security agencies reviewed the project, and the operating deal included rules that kept control of sensitive zones in Israeli hands. Officials stressed that the Navy and other security bodies still control the bases and decide who can access key areas around them. The government also went ahead with a separate sale of the old Haifa Port Company to a partnership between India's Adani Ports Group and the local firm Godot. The deal was worth about $1.1 billion and was completed in the early 2020s. It brought in a major investor from a country much closer to Washington and helped ease some of the backlash over China's role.
I learned a lot from the Chinese team. He have amazing idea, and that's what helped us.
While the debate over cranes and contracts played out on the waterfront, another huge project was taking shape between the coast and the hills. Tel Aviv is Israel's main business hub on the shore, and Jerusalem sits inland on higher ground. By train, the old Jaffa-Jerusalem line twisted slowly through the valleys and ended at a station on the edge of the city. A one-way trip from Tel Aviv to southern Jerusalem could take more than an hour, and the train did not even reach the downtown area. The new electrified line changed that pattern. Branching off the main coastal railway east of Tel Aviv, it runs for about 35 miles to a deep, underground terminal in central Jerusalem. It was designed for trains that can run close to 100 miles per hour. The ride from Tel Aviv's main stations to the new underground station in Jerusalem takes around half an hour, including a stop at the airport. Building that kind of line in steep country meant carving long tunnels through the hills and lifting the rails onto high bridges. Passenger trains do not handle sharp curves and steep climbs well, so engineers had to keep the route as straight and level as they could. Several long tunnels were dug, including one pair that runs for roughly 7 miles through solid rock, built with tunnel boring machines, giant drills that slowly cut through the rock. Where deep valleys cut across the path, engineers built concrete viaducts, long bridge structures for trains. The largest is known as Bridge 10. It crosses a wide valley on tall columns and runs for close to 3,200 feet. At its highest point, the bridge deck stands more than 300 feet above the ground, so trains can sweep across the gap at speed instead of dropping down into the valley and climbing back out again. All of that leads to one main hub beneath Jerusalem. Instead of ending at a station above ground, the line drops under the city into Yitzhak Navon Station, which sits about 260 feet below street level, near the main bus station. It is one of the deepest heavy rail stations in the world. Passengers enter at ground level, move through a bright hall, and then ride long escalators or high-speed elevators down to the platforms. The depth is not just an engineering trick to keep the tracks on a gentle slope. The underground halls and platforms also double as a large protected shelter, with tens of thousands of square feet of space carved inside the rock, thick walls, blast-resistant doors, and strong air systems that can pull in outside air, filter it, and push it through the tunnels while smoke and dust are vented away. By the time the fast line fully opened near the end of the last decade, the link between Jerusalem and the coast felt completely different. With ports modernized and cities pulled closer together, Israel's biggest export was no longer goods, it was gas. Israel's gas goes global. Once Israel's offshore gas fields were feeding its own power plants, a new problem appeared: leaders had to decide what to do with the gas they did not strictly need at home. The answer has turned into a web of pipelines that now links Israel's coast to Jordan, to Egypt, and from there out to Europe.
But the European Union is looking everywhere it can to reduce its reliance on Russian gas.
In a short time, large discoveries in the Mediterranean, led by the Leviathan field, gave Israel hundreds of billions of cubic meters of gas and a land network strong enough to move that fuel to power stations and factories. For the first time, planners could talk about long-term surplus, not just survival. That opened arguments over how much gas to keep underground for future generations and how much to sell abroad, especially once the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the early 2020s sent global prices and demand soaring. Jordan became the first big test of this export strategy. The kingdom has almost no oil or gas of its own and has lived for years with heavy energy import bills and a grid that always feels tight. In 2016, the state power company, NEPCO, signed a long-term agreement to buy gas from the Leviathan partners.
The Leviathan is one of the largest deepwater oil rigs in the world and has served as a crucial source of revenue for the state of Israel.
The contract covered around 45 billion cubic meters spread over roughly 15 years and was priced at about $10 billion when it was approved. Technically, the plan was simple. A new pipeline carries Israeli gas into northern Jordan, where it feeds gas-fired power stations that supply a large share of the national grid. Pipeline gas is usually cheaper than importing heavy fuel oil, and it lets grid operators ramp turbines up and down quickly as demand changes through the day. For officials who had faced blackouts and budget crises, steady fuel from next door looked like an obvious choice.
It's something like 6, 7, 8% of what we are still receiving from Russian gas. So it is the first small step, but we need other steps.
Politically, it was explosive. Protests broke out in Amman and other cities as soon as the deal became public. Activists and some lawmakers branded the fuel enemy gas and argued that Jordan should not tie its power system to a state many citizens still view as an occupier. Court cases tried to stop the imports, and motions in Parliament called for the contract to be torn up. Yet while slogans filled the streets, engineers quietly opened the valves. Turning off that tap would carry a high price. Jordan would have to hunt for new supplies on the world market at a higher cost, or accept more power cuts in a country that already struggles with basic services. Regional studies suggest that cheaper Israeli gas can save Jordan hundreds of millions of dollars each year compared with other options. In practice, those savings have kept the deal alive. Farther southwest, Egypt has had a complicated history with natural gas. After the giant Zohr field was found off its Mediterranean coast, leaders in Cairo briefly talked about becoming a major exporter and regional hub, backed by two large coastal plants at Idku and Damietta that can chill gas into a liquid and load it onto tankers. But as Egypt's population passed 100 million people and electricity demand climbed, local production struggled to keep up. Within a few years, Egypt slipped back into being an importer again.
To have and not be dependent on other countries. We did have a huge fund in the Mediterranean offshore.
Factories, air conditioners, and basic services needed more gas than domestic fields could supply. That opened a space for Israeli fuel. In 2018, a private group called Dolphinus signed a deal worth around $15 billion to buy roughly 64 billion cubic meters of gas from Israel's Tamar and Leviathan fields over about 10 years. The gas would cross the Sinai border by pipeline, help run Egyptian power stations, and feed the liquefaction plants on the coast. As shortages deepened, that first deal became only a starting point. Export volumes from Israel were later raised to around 85 billion cubic meters spread over roughly 15 years. Engineers upgraded the old East Mediterranean gas line between Ashkelon and El Arish and began work on new links like the Nitzana route on the land border, designed to push hundreds of millions of cubic feet of gas per day into Egypt. By the middle of the 2020s, Leviathan alone was sending a major share of its output to Egyptian buyers.
Given the enormous amount of economic aid and the like, has basically pressured them into this deal.
Israel's total gas exports rose by more than 10% in the year 2024, driven mainly by higher flows to Egypt and Jordan. In the summer of 2025, the relationship deepened again. Partners in Leviathan and Egyptian firms signed a record agreement worth up to $35 billion to send about 130 billion cubic meters of gas to Egypt through around the year 2040. As field expansions and new pipelines, including the Nitzana route, come online, total export capacity to Egypt is expected to climb above 2 billion cubic feet per day. For Israel, that means decades of steady income. Much of this fuel does not stay inside Egypt. Some is burned in Egyptian turbines, but a large share is turned into liquefied natural gas, usually called LNG, at the Idku and Damietta sites.
The share of coal being used went from 50% to 20% in just 15 years, and that's thanks to gas.
That is where Europe comes in. When Russian troops crossed into Ukraine in early 2022, European governments rushed to cut their dependence on Russian pipeline gas. That same summer, the European Union signed a memorandum of understanding with Israel and Egypt. Under that framework, European buyers can help finance and purchase gas from the eastern Mediterranean, send it by pipeline to Egypt's liquefaction plants, and then ship it as LNG cargoes to ports across southern Europe. So far, the volumes involved are only a modest share of Europe's total demand, but they matter when markets are tight or other supplies are cut. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.